Well, right at the beginning. Now we have a short intro. Do you need the pointer? All right.
Welcome to the 2023 edition of Trieste Next. I'm Luca, an AI-generated speaker who will be presenting our festival. In the next 3 days, we will be talking about a new world. This is the title of the 12th edition of our Festival of Science. Innovation and research, the ethical limits and new frontiers of science will be the center of all our events. What will the new world be like? Will we be able to face the challenges of the near future applying new scientific discoveries and technologies in a sustainable way? This will be the underlying theme of Trieste Next, with 100 events in English and Italian, the Science Book of the Year Literary Award, 300 speakers, 70 activities for schools and 40 exhibition spaces that are open for everybody in the city center close to the town hall. Before leaving the floor to our next panelists, I would like to thank all the scientific institutions within the Trieste City of Knowledge Network, the main partner together with our content partners and sponsors for supporting our project. Mostly, thank you to the 200 volunteers who are helping us. I have one last remark for all of you. The next event will last 75 minutes. Our speakers will answer all of your questions in the final 15 minutes. Also, please remember to check the updated schedule of events on our website. Thank you and enjoy our festival.
Good evening, everybody. This is Antonio Macconi. I'm the director of the Trieste Next Festival. First of all, I would like to welcome to Trieste all the international students that have been selected for the International Academy program. And I'm very happy that you are here with us tonight. It's quite a feat to have a crowded room at 9 p.m. on a Friday evening. So I'm very happy to be with you tonight. I have one very practical favor to ask the people in the room if they can open the doors there because it's crazy hot up here. And so thank you very much. Tonight we'll be talking about very precious book that we published in Italian a few months ago. I actually had the pleasure to translate it into Italian. And we have the author here, Henry Sanderson, so please give him a round of applause. Welcome to Trieste and to our festival. Harry Sander is a former journalist for the Financial Times. He's been living in China for quite a long time, and he's been correspondent for all matters related to the transition to electric mobility and to batteries. And together with us tonight, we have Andrea Condotta, who's the Innovation Officer for Gruber Logistics, a company based in Italy, and we'll go more into details later on regarding how the transition to electric is affecting the logistics sector. As our AI-generated presenter reminded us, the event will last 75 minutes. The first 60 minutes will be our discussion, and then we'll open the floor to your questions. So start thinking about your any kind of comments, remarks, and so on. Henry, you prepared a presentation for us. Your book is entitled, in Italian, it's Il prezzo della sostenibilità, vincitori e vinti nella corsa globale all'auto elettrica. The English title, the original title, is Volt Rush, the winners and losers in the race to go green. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Please, welcome.
Thank you very much. I use this, right?
Yeah.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you all for turning up, as you said, on a Friday night to hear about this topic. I'll just give a brief presentation, and then we'll open it up to the discussion. Number one, I think it's good to remind everyone how old clean energy technologies are, and for how long we've been trying to I guess, move away from fossil fuels, how long the struggle has been to get us to even where we are now. This person in this picture here is Thomas Edison. He is one of the most famous American inventors ever, and every day, seemingly, an invention would come out of his mind. When we think of him, we probably think about the light bulb, which is one of his key contributions. But in my book, I'd say we should think about the battery when we think about him, because Edison actually spent millions of his own money and many years of his life in frustration trying to find a better battery, come up with a better solution. And we all know this man, Henry Ford. He's the greatest car baron of all time. The Model T transformed the automotive history. But him and Edison actually his wife actually drove an electric vehicle at the time. This is Detroit Electric, which his wife drove. And Edison and Ford worked on an electric vehicle over 100 years ago. And this is the only picture from the archives that we have of this vehicle. You can see the batteries there. And it's important to note how close we got over 100 years ago. These few graphs, electric vehicles are in green, but they basically show the number of models, the number of producers, and the cost between electric vehicles, gasoline, and steam. And over 100 years ago, it was very, very close. So similar number of models, similar number of producers, and the cost was also very similar. So we could have seen a completely alternative history where perhaps electric vehicles could have been used for inner city, for shorter distances. And I think instead, the oil age of the 20th century, in some ways, is a tragedy, because we were so close to not being so addicted to oil for every transport use. And we all know the geopolitical implications of that, reliance on the Middle East, the resource curse, the empowerment of oil-rich dictators, etc. So what I'm interested now is, as we finally move to this clean energy age, where we have wind and solar, hydropower, we're going to need a different sort of geopolitics, and a different sort of geopolitics is already happening remarkably quickly, which is what I'm interested in. And we're going to need lots of batteries. I know this might sound like a dry topic, but if you think about the number of cars on the road is 2 billion, roughly, and we need to electrify so many of those vehicles, trucks, we'll talk about. And then if you think about solar and wind are intermittent. The sun, obviously, if you look at when solar power is strong, it's in the middle of the day, and then it dies off in the late afternoon. So we need batteries to help store some of this energy, to shift solar energy from that peak in the middle of the day to later in the day when perhaps demand is higher. So we're going to need a huge amount of batteries. If you look at batteries, we also need lots of raw materials as well. So this is a rough growth of batteries out to 2050. To get there, this is what Elon Musk roughly says we need by 2050. To get there, we're going to need lots of minerals, lithium, cobalt, manganese, nickel. This is what I write about in the book. What I'm saying is it's not easy, it's not simple, and the scale of the challenge is huge. If you look at the current mineral supply, it looks, longer term like we're facing quite severe shortages. So we need more investment in everything, really, in mines, in processing, in batteries. Just a final point, and we'll get onto this in our discussion. Every vehicle is very different in terms of resource use, battery size. I'm not sure how many of you drive an electric vehicle, but if you've been to America, you'll see they love pickup trucks. The Ford F-150 is the best-selling vehicle in America. An electric version uses a lot of materials, has a huge battery, whereas if you go to China, actually they have a lot of cheap electric vehicles, smaller electric vehicles that use no cobalt, no nickel, etc. And then if you go all the way up to trucks, we'll hear more, but you need huge batteries, and that obviously means a lot of resources. So how we think about mobility going forward will have a big impact on the scale of the challenge. Just one final note, which is to say that moving from fossil fuels to electricity means you increase the efficiency. So the total amount of energy that we'll need for the same amount of work will go down, because batteries are much more efficient than fossil fuels. Fossil fuels, you waste a lot of energy, so it's important to keep that in mind. This is my book, Volt Rush, that came out last year, and I try to be, I believe in the energy transition, I believe in electric vehicles. I'm just trying to open people's eyes to what it takes to build out the supply chains, the infrastructure that we need, to stress how much of an industrial revolution this is. And secondly, the geopolitics of it, that China has an extremely dominant role in every part of clean energy that you can think of. Just to give you a rough example, China produces over 90% of the solar panels, over 90% of the graphite mineral used in batteries, over 90% of the rare earth permanent magnets used in electric vehicles. It has a dominant role in pretty much every area of clean energy that you look at. And we're at this interesting time now where the Western world wants to decarbonize, wants to move forward, but we also have to rely on China to do that. So how much do we delay the energy transition by trying to re-establish production, what China is already doing in the West in order to boost our national security, but we might increase the cost, we might delay the energy transition. So this is a fundamental conflict that we in the West face. We're in a catch-22 at the moment. It's very, very difficult to know which is the best route through this dilemma. But I'm happy to talk more about it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Henry. Before starting the discussion, I wanted to ask you to briefly describe the supply chain, because you mentioned the role of China. We all know that when we're talking about batteries and electric cars, but we, like any kind of battery, we have batteries in our mobile phones, we have batteries in our vacuum cleaner, we have batteries in our electric toothbrushes. So basically, they all go through the same process. And we're talking about mainly 4 elements, that is nickel, cobalt, lithium, and copper, which are rare in a way, but mostly they're managed by China. So can you take us on a journey? What you describe in the book is basically a journey that you did, which started from China and went basically all around the world in order to assess not only the environmental but also the social impact of the search of our quest for rare metals.
Yeah, so it's a story really of how the global economy works and how the last few decades have shaped this global economy. If you think about any device, our phones or electric vehicles, they all begin life as raw material that's mined. And mines are best to do in the places that are most economic to do it, that have the best geological deposits. Because mining is an industry of producing waste. So you're mining 90+% waste for a very small amount of minerals. So the raw materials come from the big mining countries, Australia, Chile. Chile is the biggest copper and lithium producer. Countries in Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo produces almost the world's cobalt, nickel from Indonesia. But all this metal, once it's mined, basically gets sent to China. So China's really, in so many ways, at the center of global supply chains. All this material gets sent to China, where it's processed into useful forms. And these are in smelters or other things around China. and then it normally stays in China to be made into batteries or battery materials, or it goes to Korea and Japan. Then it will go back to, can go back to China from Korea and Japan, and then then it could go to Europe or the US to be made into electric vehicles. So someone like Tesla, let's just take Tesla as an example. It's an early pioneer in electric vehicles. It's only just started to make its own batteries on its own, and it's only just starting to process its own lithium. But before that, and to a large extent, it still relies on this Chinese supply chain. So why is this? It's the way we built the global economy, where 2 decades ago, I don't know if many of you went to China in the late 90s, early 2000s, China had all these advantages of low labor cost, low environmental standards, a workforce that was migrating from rural to urban areas that was keen to work. And they, as we all know, became the manufacturing center of the world, but they also became a key producer of batteries and other electronic equipment, and they've moved up the value chain since then. So when China started to support clean energy, these companies could seize that opportunity and move up the value chain. And Xi Jinping, what he wants now, what he wants for China is a country of science and technology, producing high-value goods in what he calls strategic emerging industries, or these industries. And clean energy is one of these key industries that China has wanted to dominate and does dominate. And so it's taken its advantages from being at the lower end of supply chains to moving up.
We'll go back to the timing. You've been talking about 20 years ago, and in the second series of questions, we'll go back to the timing and see Europe's role in these 20 years. But first of all, I wanted to welcome Andrea Condotta to the Trieste Next Festival. I would like to have a general comment on what he's been talking about, and then we'll go more into details, because we've been talking about electric mobility, but of course electric mobility for individual transportation is quite different in terms of challenges than the transportation of goods and logistics.
Well, first of all, let's see that my point of view refers more to the freight transport. That's my topic. What I love of Henry's book is the complexity. We are used to define what is good and what is bad, and it comes basically more from the political communication, the media communication. And so the mistake that we can do with the first approach with Henry's book is he's against electric vehicles, because he's going into the details of the problems coming from the transition towards a different supply chain. And the interesting aspect is that he said, no, I'm in favor. And probably the people that could criticize Henry the most will be probably the people that are in favor of electric vehicles. And that's a big issue that we have when we touch the topic of sustainability. So sustainability is considered good in any case for the ideological point of view. But there are some matters which have produced even worse effect. When we embraced certain kind of changes, we embraced those changes without taking care of the complexity. Let's say the first example that jumped to my mind is the biodiesel. A couple of decades ago, we were pushing a lot for biodiesel, making obligation for the usage of biodiesel and so on. At the moment, there were not many kind of consideration related to where do we take this kind of amount of biodiesel. And literally, we cut forests to produce biodiesel. So the effect that we produced for a good purpose, pushing the decarbonization of transport, were definitely worse than the previous situation. So think that the transition towards e-mobility is a necessary step that we need to take. Also in the freight transport, where it's a kind of difficult to implement it for certain kind of reasons. But practically speaking, we don't have alternatives. Biofuels are definitely a good point, but we cannot produce biodiesel or bio LNG, so liquefied biomethane. We can, but with consequences. So the most sustainable biofuels come from waste. We cannot produce waste. Therefore, we need to think about something else. And definitely e-mobility also in the freight transport is a good point. And obviously, there's something which is interesting on the book when we speak about a global value chain. And there, we are experiencing something new. I mean that, let's speak about the oil value chain. In that case, the roles, I would say, are quite clear. There are extractive economies, which has the raw materials, but we have the knowledge. That's more or less clear. So Russia is a powerful country and so on and so on. But if we look at the GDP of Russia is much less than the Italian one. And the reason is because they are an extractive economy, and we have the added value. We produce the added value. If we think about China, it's a little bit different. They have the control of the raw materials, but they have also the knowledge for producing added value final products.
Do you want to add anything?
No, I think it's a good point. When you're thinking of systems at big scale, like we need for the energy transition, if you're thinking of solutions that need to be scaled up 20 times, the electric vehicle market's growing at 25% a year, but still we need to grow much, much faster. If you're thinking about that, you need to think about the unintended consequences and the impacts of new solutions and new technologies. You might increase demand for one material and decrease for another. So you've really got to think about all the sort of unintended consequences. The biggest unintended impact, I think, of shifting everything to China over the last 30 years is the carbon intensity, right? Coal still powers 60, 70% of China's electricity. So we've shifted so much manufacturing, et cetera, to China without at all thinking about the carbon impact. So again, that's another example. So where can we manufacture in the most advantageous places going forward? I was saying I was just in Sweden this week, and north of Sweden has hydropower. It's both cheap and green. So a lot of manufacturing now is investing there. That's the kind of place we need to start doing those things.
Yeah, we'll go back into the European efforts and European take on the Volt Rush. We mentioned the topic of sustainability. And when we think about sustainability, we often, and most of the times, we think about environmental sustainability, but then we also have social sustainability. And your book goes into details of the social impact that the supply chain is having in specific parts of the world. I'm thinking about, well, the Congo, and all the child labor situation. I'm thinking about the indigenous communities in Australia and Indonesia. Can you further elaborate on that?
Yeah, so this is a huge issue for the energy transition. How do we make it a just transition? How do we get communities involved rather than replicating this model where we in the rich world drive electric vehicles and we shift the costs and damages onto other places? I think countries like Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, it is a complicated situation, but they are like the Saudi Arabia in cobalt, so over 70% of the world's cobalt. And I think what had happened was all of us with our mobile phones and other products have never really cared enough about the supply chain. And essentially it was a supply chain where ordinary people in the Congo dig up cobalt and copper by hand, no safety protection, often children involved, a lot of deaths and injuries. And they take this material to Chinese traders. You can see them there on the side of the road. And then the material gets all sent to China and mixed up, ends up in our phones, etc. I think the change with electric vehicle is it's supposed to be a green good. Well, it is a green good. So people expect better for the supply chain. So it's really shifted the attitude onto that supply chain where, someone like Elon Musk or Tesla, child labor is just not acceptable, right, in their supply chain. I think what we've seen now is more engagement with the DRC, trying to. It's hard to find solutions, but because there aren't many alternatives there in terms of livelihood. So there's no one simple solution, but I think there's more engagement now, which is what we need to see. And what my book is trying to say is that we open up our eyes to some of these issues. The problem still is, though, that going back to your point, is companies are very scared, and we know about this trend to green hushing. They're even scared to reveal what they're doing. They're very scared to accept something that's not perfect. So as a result, they won't buy cobalt from the Congo that's been mined by hand and hold up their hand and say, this is what I'm doing. It's not perfect, but it's getting better. So as a result, we have this situation where, yes, that material still goes to China. We all use it. But it's no nice-looking company report's going to say, I'm using this material. So that's part of the problem with some of the sustainability discussions is everything has to be perfect, otherwise we can't accept it. But it doesn't mean it stops happening. So this is a real issue. And I think from the DRC's point of view, from the Congos, they've got a huge natural resource bounty, right? They've got a huge amount of natural resource wealth. They've got copper. They've got lithium in the Congo as well. They've got hydropower. They've got a lot of young population. So how do they get better value out of their resources rather than just sending it to China, which is, I guess, a colonial, semi-colonial model? How do they get more out of it? That's one of the discussions in this energy transition. How can we make sure communities get value from it, get the jobs from it? And it's not just, the interesting thing is, it's not just a question for developing countries. In the UK, where I'm from, we have the same issue. We're not getting the jobs from the energy transition. So people are like, well, screw that. Why should I pay more? So we have to try and get people on side and see the benefits. Yeah.
You mentioned a few times that the product in itself is not perfect. So can both of you, in their respective fields of expertise, talk about the level of advancement in terms of technology?
Yeah, so yes, electric vehicle has, to produce an electric vehicle battery and electric vehicle, the carbon emissions, or it costs more intense to produce, but because it's not consuming fossil fuels, because it's running hopefully on green electricity, you pay back that cost by using it. But what we need to do is reduce the carbon emissions from producing electric vehicles as much as we can, because we don't want to add unnecessary carbon into the atmosphere. I mean, imagine that, as I said at the beginning, we need to convert 2 billion cars to electric, right? And already in China, over 30% of new vehicle sales are electric, so it's a huge amount. So we need to reduce the excess carbon that we're putting into the atmosphere. And if you think about these minerals, they're mined using fossil fuels, they're processed using fossil fuels. You wouldn't believe the processing steps. You need to heat these materials to 1,000 degrees, 3,000 degrees, using fossil fuels. They're shipped and trucked around using fossil fuels. So all of that is huge opportunity for entrepreneurs and for innovation to bring down that carbon footprint. So that's the issue now. If you take an electric vehicle, used in China, they're charging it with coal-fired power. It's being made with coal-fired power. It's being made using fossil fuels in the process. So all of that needs to come down, which is certainly possible, right? I mean, it's not beyond humans to do that. Yeah.
Let's say it really depends when we speak about logistics and which kind of segment of logistics we are referring to. Let's say that if we take into consideration urban logistics, so it means the vans that go in the cities, in that framework there is a good level of technology. The challenges are not so high, let's say. The way that you need to transport is not impossible, let's say. And also from the market point of view, there is a kind of push from public authorities, at least all around Europe, to, in a way, impose the usage of electric vehicles going inside the city in order to bring to zero what we call tank-to-wheel emissions, so the emissions that come from the direct usage of the vehicle. While if you go in more challenging segments of the logistics, such as the long-haul heavy-duty vehicle, we are seeing right now the first electric vehicles coming in the market. The performances of such vehicles are quite low. We are speaking, for instance, I don't know, if I take a truck already going on alternative fuels, for instance, an LNG truck going on liquefied methane, that truck can perform 1,350 kilometers, let's say. While the trucks that we have right now, the electric trucks in the market, can perform 250. So I cannot say that they cannot be really used, but they can just be used in specific transformations. We need to admit that it's very difficult to think that electric vehicles will reach the level of performances of other vehicles with other technologies. Nonetheless, it's also true that we can revise our logistic models, since in any case, an electric vehicle can stop, or a diesel vehicle can stop when the truck driver needs to stop. So let's say after 300 kilometers generally, it means that the truck driver has done 4 hours, and it also means that he can stop. If he can stop and recharge very fast, there's no real limitation in having less kilometers. The matter is that we don't have that kind of network. So let's say at the moment, in the situation that we are taking the first steps towards the introduction of e-trucks in the freight transport, which is a challenge that we need to take if we really want to take the challenge, if we really want to decarbonize the road transport. But obviously, if we want to compare the technological level that we have right now with the trucking, with other kind of technologies, we are kind of far away.
We were talking about this over dinner a few minutes ago, and you mentioned that the time frame is actually quite short, that the whole process started a few years ago. What are your expectations in terms of technological advancement? Are there any expectations?
Let's say we are also participating as companies.
Forecasts?
Yeah, sure. But we are participating as a company in research project with many different players. I'm speaking about projects in which you have all the IOMs, so the producers of the vehicle, the components, the producers of chargers, and so on. All this kind of working group together, investing in order to push the e-mobility. And let's say our time span is, let's say, to have new prototypes, electric vehicles for heavy-duty transport, able to reach 500 kilometers in 2025. It doesn't mean that they could not arrive before. Those projects are also linked to hydrogen vehicles, so we're not just focused on one kind of technology. And potentially hydrogen vehicles could reach more kilometers, so more than 750 kilometers. That's the scope, at least, of these research projects. Let's say the tricky point with these two technology is that from one side you have battery vehicles and the weight of the battery is quite high, so you cannot add too many batteries on the vehicle. Otherwise, you reach the maximum of the weight for the truck. Then more weight for the battery means less weight for the load that you can transport. And obviously, it will bring a stronger efficiency in the transport. And if we speak about hydrogen vehicles, in that case, you are able to storage in less volume, less weight, quite a lot of energy, but they are quite inefficient. So if I'm able to do, for instance, with 60 kilowatt hour, 40 kilometers with an electric vehicle, I can do 10, 12 kilometers with a hydrogen truck. So, and if let's say we move towards battery vehicles or hydrogen vehicles, and we are not able to produce green energy, we're just playing a game. I mean, we're not bringing real results. I was mentioning before that we consider tank to wheel as, let's say, a calculation of emission when we use a certain kind of fuels or energy or whatever. But there is another part, which is the well to tank, how the energy is produced, how the fuel is produced. So when we make a proper calculation of emissions, we need to consider the whole chain. Otherwise, maybe the vehicle is zero emission from the tank to wheel perspective, but maybe we have cut trees or whatsoever in order to produce energy or fuel.
Yeah, I was going to say that's a very important point. When you look at hydrogen, you mentioned the so-called round-trip efficiency. That if we're generating electricity with wind and solar, we want to use that first for uses. So we need to be in a situation where we have excess electricity that's generated that can be used to make hydrogen. But we're not really, as far as I know, there are a few projects, but it's not really at scale. If you look at all the hydrogen produced last year, less than 1% was made with renewable energy. So the rest is made using fossil fuels. So there is this debate about hydrogen, which is how much are fossil fuel companies using it to greenwash or to promote business as usual, right? Because so little is produced using clean energy, and that I think is a huge problem. Maybe it's a horse and cart problem. We need to produce enough green hydrogen to also have the trucks. So yeah.
Yeah, but I mean, the relevant point is to understand is that we are not thinking about introducing something new. We are not, as let's say, transport companies. The game is not that we are using a diesel truck, then we arrive on an electric truck, and that's it. The game is finished. We are moving, as Henry is also describing in the book, we are moving an economy, a system, from a certain kind of model that has been implemented in decades, and it's working with all the consequences that we know for the environment and so on and so on. But we are moving towards a different kind of economy, and certainly there will be consequences. But coming back to my first comment, my first statement, can we really avoid to do it? And my personal answer is not. We need to do it. But we need to be also aware about the consequences, and we need to find the right solutions for the different elements. I'm super in favor of embracing the complexity, even if we don't have the answers. That's the game that we need to play.
I think we are all in favor of course, we're not, this is not a debate of being pro or anti the transition to electric mobility. It's really a matter of understanding the complexity that's behind it, and also the role that we want to play as citizens and as consumers. We potentially are all future consumers. We are already consumers of batteries, considering all the batteries that we have in our lives. But I believe that we need to be aware of, as we said, the supply chain. Do you think companies are ready for this shift? Like, what's your vision on it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think, I think if you look at the history, no, a lot of companies weren't ready. Yes, Tesla was ready, but look at the other automotive companies, right?
Especially European companies like Dieselgate. it's not that far away in terms of like time frame.
That's the thing. Look how slow they've been, right? It took a Tesla to finally like prod them into action, but they've been slow. And the question is, do they now get subsidies because they've been slow and get rewarded for it? I don't know. But yeah, a lot of companies have been too slow, and I think also are being too slow. And I think the problem is that, with everything to do with carbon, there's no cost on it, right? So it's sometimes hard to impose that cost when society is not imposing that cost for polluting. So I think what we need to see in the future, and what is happening, is we're going to see carbon border tariffs, right? European Union thinking of carbon, so to try and change trade so that you don't just have the highest pollutive company who's the lowest costs getting market share. So you somehow have to account for the emissions that you're producing. So in that sense, I think companies aren't ready. And I think also China faces a huge issue, right? China has built its economy on dirty industry, on coal-fired power, as well as clean energy. But they could be shut out of markets like Europe, without improving. So I feel like companies aren't ready. There's also been a lot of greenwashing, right? So companies have greenwashed for years, and they haven't taken action. And I keep reading news stories every other day about how all these offsets are useless, right, and don't actually offset any emissions at all. So that's been going on for years too. So rather than take the hard action, this is what companies have been doing. And I think there is this backlash against ESG, especially in America. And yeah, I don't agree with it, but I can see how elements of it you can get angry about, right? That there's been all this greenwashing and sustainability, but they haven't actually done the hard work. And I think that's or put the money behind the hard work as well.
You mentioned at the very beginning that your field of specialization is freight logistics. What's your take on, so you're working basically with companies, right?
Yeah, sure. Well, we, as a logistics company, we work in the business-to-business framework. I think that the right question should be, are consumers ready for the sustainability? Since I think that the companies are not good or bad, they act in order to satisfy a certain kind of demand. And right now, the companies have a priority which is not really doing sustainability, it's showing off that they are doing something in the framework of sustainability. If you look at the rating of sustainability, I'm afraid to say that it's more a paperwork. Just to be precise, we also decided to have a sustainability report in the company. And we have decided to do it not because we are obliged, but because we wanted to have a certain kind of assessment. When we finished it, the consultant company that we took for doing the sustainability report, they said, you were like this in terms of sustainability. After the sustainability report, your rating increased quite a lot. And I said, okay, we are the same as before. It didn't change anything. And then we started to realize the game. Let's imagine a paradox, no? And it also refers to this social sustainability point of view. So it means that if you have a super sustainable company from the practical point of view, let's say in my framework with using zero emissions vehicle, with a perfect management of the employees, perfect, let's say, impact on the society. And on the other side, you have a super bad company from the practical point of view. But the bad company is doing a lot of paper, such as strategy framework, good tactics for sustainability. They monitor what they do. They monitor scope 1, scope 2, scope 3, blah, 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 and the other company is not doing anything, but just taking care of practical matters. In the rating of sustainability, this company is great. Super cool company. And you see it in the freight transport when you see, for instance, company transporting by air. Air is the most polluting way of transport. And there are companies which has a super high rating in terms of sustainability. And you say, how is it possible? The emission rate of those companies is super high. But they have a lot of paper, strategy, tactics, blah, 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 blah. That's a tricky point that we have right now. We need to start, let's say, from the consumers. The consumer need to really push the company to show what they do in terms of the emissions, in terms of practical examples, and so on and so on. This will change the behavior of the company from showing off that they are doing some stuff, a lot of paper. You can understand how a company is sustainable right now on the kilos of paper that they were able to produce. We need to move from this kind of mentality towards doing really practical things.
We've been, it's the last few minutes of our discussions, and then we'll open the floor to your questions, so get ready. We've been talking a lot about like time frame and the so-called age, battery age that you mentioned in the book started almost 20 years ago in China. Europe was quite late in the process. Can you tell us a little bit more? Because everybody knows about Tesla, of course, but we mentioned that China is actually the big player. And what China basically did is creating a new market and through subsidies and the politics of subsidies. So can you let us know a little bit more about this?
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at clean energy overall, it's not that Europe was behind. I think Europe, in some ways, was from a policy point of view quite pioneering. In Germany, in the early 2000s, introduced feed-in tariff for solar that led to a huge solar boom, and Spain and other countries. I think what happened though is you went from a state where Europe was encouraging clean energy to a state where China ended up dominating the manufacturing of solar, and almost every European solar company went bankrupt, after the financial crisis. So it's kind of an extraordinary, the victory was almost total by China. So it was an extraordinary situation, and now we see a similar thing happening again, where European companies, solar companies, have started up again, but prices are falling, and there's overcapacity in China. So we keep seeing these issues. But I think the truth is that it's very hard to compete against China, not only because of the subsidies, but the scale of investment they put towards these things, and also the technological improvements, the improvements that they make. So it's very hard for Europe to compete. And now we've got this additional problem, which is the US has introduced this huge after complaining about Chinese subsidies, the US has introduced a huge package of subsidies and tax credits. So if you speak to a lot of startups in Europe or companies in Europe, they all want to invest in the US now. So Europe's facing a big problem, because does Europe have the money to subsidize a whole clean energy economy, facing competition from China and then from the US as well? This is the issue. And I think we're seeing in France, we're seeing clusters develop in France, in Sweden, as I mentioned, elsewhere, where they have advantages, energy, etc. But in each case, government has to come up with money, right, and help and subsidize. So this is really a big issue. Even in the US, all this money is being invested, but how cost competitive is it all going to be? When you start subsidizing at such a big scale, there can be unintended consequences. You need to make sure these companies can sustain themselves. But I don't think in economic history we've ever seen a country like China where they can build at massive scale. They have a lot of subsidies and benefits. It's very hard to compete against in this field. Yeah.
If I may, I see the situation really complex. Also looking at the title of this panel, who's winning, who is losing. That's really tricky, since practically speaking, if we consider the value chain of trucks right now, who's really producing those trucks? I mean, if I take, let's say, the final product, Tesla went in the market with the first truck, but Volvo, which is a European company, coming in the market more or less in the same period. Nonetheless, who is really producing the components of those vehicles? We are expecting that there will be new brands coming from China. But in terms of batteries, certainly, yes, they are extremely advanced. But there are companies in Europe producing components, high-level components, which are super strong, extremely strong. And they are not very well known, but they are super big. I mean, how many people in the room knows, for instance, Valeo? How many? One, two.
1, 2, 3.
3. So it's a company which is super advanced in terms of technology in automotive. It's a 20 billion company. So we are speaking about a huge company. And speaking with the people of the board of the company, they basically say that the products that they have in the market are 2 years in, let's say, back behind of what they really have. So that when they put a product in the market, it's not the most advanced one. They have 2 years of an advantage that they want to take and to maintain. If there is someone of the competitors pushing, they have already the product ready there. And so they have a primary role in the value chain, which is really difficult to touch. Or I don't know, how many people know Brembo, which is an Italian company?
Yeah,
that's
more
that's
than
easier.
three.
That's easier. It's the world leader in brakes. So there will be Chinese cars or trucks coming in the market. That's for sure. But the components of those trucks will be Chinese. Some of them certainly yes. Some of them will come from Europe. As right now we have European vehicles which are partially made in different countries all around the world. It means that basically we have such an integrated value chain right now, which is really difficult to me to determine who is winning, who is losing. Certainly, it's very what I said before. I mean, the situation is completely different from before. We are not the only one having the knowledge for producing added value products. Right now, there is China and other countries all around the world which are gaining advantage from the knowledge that they have acquired, also thanks to our great support in the previous years. But the situation is very tricky, very confused. Also in the battery framework, I mean, Scania has opened a factory of battery in Sweden a couple of weeks ago. Certainly, they are also buying batteries from China, but they have their own factory in Sweden. Yeah, the situation is really, really, really complex, really complex.
In the final part in the final section of your book, well, you describe first of all a European experience, well, as you mentioned in Sweden, but then you also mentioned the need for a cultural change somehow when you start talking about recycling and the possibility of actually start thinking about the way we move in a different way.
Yeah, so I think if you, there's lots of innovations that can be had, but if you look at most cars, they're sort of wasted assets, right? They're just parked most of the time. You're not using all those batteries. So as I said earlier, you're emitting carbon, you're using energy to make these batteries, to make these electric vehicles, then they're just sitting in the streets. So my question really was, do we replicate the old model where SUVs became very popular, right? Huge SUVs. Do you just electrify those and then they just sit in the street? Or can we have smaller vehicles? Can we rethink how we get around in a more sustainable fashion? I think if you look at China, look at their high-speed rail, right? Look at the impact of that from getting between cities. People used to fly from Beijing to Shanghai, and now you get the high-speed train. So all these different ways need to happen, and the US has been very behind in terms of building infrastructure like that. But these things, analysts love to project like a linear chart. we don't know how the future is going to develop and how people are going to get around, right? There could be innovations. Young people are not learning to drive. Driving license applications are much lower than they were. So what kind of system is going to emerge? That was also the question over 100 years ago that I talked about in my presentation, which was you had this competition for all these technologies and how is mobility going to emerge? We're facing a similar, really interesting dynamic now, and we have potential of autonomous driving, et cetera, et cetera. So or even flying taxis, things like that. So it's all up for grabs, you know. It's going to be interesting.
Okay, so now it's your turn. Is there any question in the room? It's one over here in second row, and one in the back. Well, and one here.
Good evening. I would like to ask you, how can we as consumers become more aware about the greenwashing actions taken place by, from the brands we buy?
Maybe we can take a couple of more questions. So there's one here and one in the back.
Good evening. Should I hold it? Thank you for opening a space to discuss about this. I have a comment and a question. I'm a PhD student in circular economy here at the University of Trieste. So my question is more regarding the economic system sustaining this, rather than the geopolitical tension. So I like to bring into this debate a very unpopular concept, which is that of economic degrowth. Right, our current economic system is based on a constant growth that we can measure every year, and that's how we measure how our economies are doing. However, Earth is not growing, and we have some physical limitants to how much we can take, especially when it comes to raw materials. So my question is, if it is possible to talk about a clean transition towards electric mobility, if we keep the rate of car use that we have currently, because most of these minerals that we need, they are non-renewable, right? And they are especially becoming less renewable when we mess with the cycles of air that renew them. So is it just a matter of whether China controls these minerals, or is it is also that we need to slow down? And we don't like to hear that, but thank you.
Henry, do you want to answer the first two questions?
Yeah.
On both of you.
Yeah, on the greenwashing, I think it's incredibly difficult, but I think what we're seeing now is much more attention from regulators and lawsuits being filed against companies that make misleading adverts and misleading claims. But I still see it all the time. And I think it goes back to your point also about, there's so many tricks you can play when you get a rating or assessment from someone who you're paying. So it's very hard for someone outside to know all the loopholes and the tricks you can play. But we see it every day, right? You buy a drink or something, it's like carbon neutral or something like that. But how can that be? Everything has an impact, right? And to produce anything has carbon footprint. As I say, they're probably offsetting it, but those offsets are being proven to be worthless. I think it's really hard. I think regulators, though, are hopefully going to bring in more stricter regulations so that we as consumers won't have to do so much work on it, I think. But it's a really damaging trend, I think, that has made it seem easy to go green when it actually takes a lot of hard work. If you're talking about Scope 3 emissions, takes a lot of hard work, a lot of investment as well. So I think it's been hugely damaging. Just on the question of degrowth, I read these arguments, I see these arguments. The studies show that we've exceeded every planetary boundary on this planet, that we've degraded the ecosystems to such a threatening and low level. So I do agree with the theory of it. I just don't know how it could possibly happen. And I feel like we have enough on our plate trying to transform the current economic system to one that's more sustainable, to then also try and rethink the whole of capitalism. Well, it just seems too challenging to me. I wouldn't quite know how we go about doing it, but I do think the GDP is obviously not a very good or accurate measure, so there must be other ways that we can measure growth. And I think what worries me is if you look at a country like India, if you look at all these other countries going to have huge growth in energy demand and things like that, we can't repeat the same mistakes. That, one of the greatest tragedies is that China developed since the late 90s in a very coal-heavy and fossil fuel way. If only they had gone big into renewables from the beginning, we would have saved so much pollution. So I think, yes, we do need to rethink these countries that are now going to go through periods of high energy use, high energy growth. How can they not go through the same problems? That I think is fundamental.
Andrea, you want to comment on that?
Let's say your first question was, let's say, more related to the fact that consumer has to be. That it's a tricky point, but it's an essential matter of the question. First of all, greenwashing is not so easy to be understand. Also because there are different definitions of greenwashing. No, but if we consider offsetting as greenwashing, and let's say for the people that maybe are not familiar with the concept, it means that you don't do anything for the decarbonization and you plant trees around the world and then you say, okay, my emission is 0. This is actually what happens. It's offsetting is positive in a way. I mean, if I plant trees, in any case, a positive matter. What is really bad is that if you offset, you pay few money. So it costs quite less than invest in the decarbonization and so on. In my sector, it means new vehicles, testing vehicles, different kind of fuels. So if I need to really decarbonize and offset, the cost of offset is nothing. And that's why, to me, offsetting is very risky. Really risky. When I read a company like Google saying I'm zero emission company, okay, that's really a problem. If I could manage that kind of regulation, I would totally separate the two things. Totally separate. Otherwise, the consumer cannot really understand if the company is really investing in decarbonization or is playing the game of offsetting. Which I repeat myself, is in any case positive. I mean, it's not something bad. What is bad is that when you buy a product, okay, you say it's neutral from the emission point of view, and it's not. Definitely it's not. It's not even good to say that it is, because if you want to, for instance, truly reach the zero emission using the vehicles that are right now in the market, you cannot do it. The best option that we have, for instance, right now is bio-LNG, in which we have, compared to diesel, a reduction of 91%, which is quite a lot. It's huge, but it's not 0. But it's definitely more important to say a reduction of 91% than say 0. 0 is, okay, whatsoever. And in terms of slowing down, I'm very practical as a person. So let's imagine that Europe decides to slow down. It means that in a global economy, you lose the balance. Losing the balance means worse. Just to be really, really practical. It means that you're starting to be vulnerable, to count less in the value chain, and when the situation loses the balance, and we are continually looking for a balance in the geopolitical point of view. If tomorrow we'll decide to slow down, the balance will be destroyed, basically.
There was a question here on the second row. Oh, no, but prima lui. Second row. Then.
Yes. About transportation, is there by chance any research on some level done on trying to turn plane motors more eco-friendly?
What do you mean? If there are studies going in the direction of
yes,
a lot? Yeah, I'm
but
personally.
done by the private plane companies.
Definitely. Well, I'm personally vice chair of 2.0. 2.0 is the association that has been created by the automotive sector together with the European Commission in order to define the priorities for the research in electric and hydrogen vehicles. So the research in this framework is huge. It's also huge the investments coming from the private sector and the public sector in this framework. So if you look at the main important program of the European Commission related to research, which is the Horizon, has a specific focus on mobility, which is really, really important. Just to mention the project that we are involved as a company, and there's a project which is called ZFS, which is focused on heavy-duty vehicle long haul. It's a 30 million of investments coming from private and public. Another one is Empower, again 30 million of investments from public and private. And my association, together with the European Commission, delivered more than 1 billion of investments in the last 10 years related to the for the decarbonization of transport. And it's just one part, it's a minimal part, because if you look at investment directly on the companies, it's huge. 1 billion is nothing.
There was a question here, and then we go back there.
Thank you for the talk. As the author of the book, I would like to hear your opinion on two questions. First of all, with all the materials that you explained that are exploited needed to make electric vehicles, does all that pollution produced by the exploitation makes the electric cars even worth it? And in what ways would we lower it? And as well as the fact that fuel-powered vehicles could be used for a longer amount of time if maintained properly than electric cars. And do you think that by the time most of the world starts completely using electric cars would be, let's say, too late for the environment? Thank you.
Henry.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there's ever too late, right? Because it's you know, the more we can do, the better. I don't think it's ever too late. Too late as in the world's gonna, I don't know, I mean, not too late. But yeah, so just in terms of your questions, so as I said earlier, I think electric vehicles are definitely better. It may take more carbon to produce the vehicle, but once it's running and you charge it with relatively green electricity, it's definitely better. You also have no air pollution, so air pollution kills millions every year. So they're definitely better. It's just about, as I say, reducing the carbon impact that you are having. And how can we do that? Well, one way is, a big way is energy use in a lot of these processes. As I say, is having it all done in China, using coal-fired power. So a lot of these things are moving to areas with hydropower. So that's one way to do it. But a lot of the problem is you have fossil fuels that are used in the process for heating, things like that. So perhaps hydrogen can be used to do that, or other innovations. So that's the sort of way you bring down those emissions. And then in mines themselves, you know, we can have electric mine trucks, things like that. And mines can use solar power, wind power, things like that. If you think of lots of mines in Australia, right? And Australia is going through a huge solar boom at the moment. So there's lots of potential. It's just about innovating to try and integrate renewable energy sources into these processes, because big industrial furnaces or things like that, once you turn them on, you don't want to be turning them off again when the sun goes down or the wind doesn't blow. You want to have it operating 24/7. So we need innovations, or we need hydropower or things like that. So there are ways to do it, but it's definitely better. And to your point of lasting long, you're right. The huge improvement we can make is to make products last longer. And if you speak to entrepreneurs, a big problem is we may come up with a better product that lasts longer, but companies often don't want to do it because they're not making profit from it. You wouldn't believe how much is driven by companies. They don't want products to last longer because they don't have a business model. But electric vehicles at the moment are lasting a long time. The batteries are lasting a long time. So we're talking 15 years or something, and then we can recycle the batteries and get some of these minerals back. Takes energy to recycle, of course, but we can recycle them and get them back. So eventually, if you think about the way it works, we need to meet the demand now, so we need to mine now to get the minerals, but eventually we can move to a more closed-loop system. But at the moment, we don't have the batteries to recycle. It will come, though, for sure.
We have time for one last question, so over there.
In relation to kind of regulation, I know the EU recently announced the kind of Green Claims Directive in that they would fine companies for improper advertisation of its ESG commitments. Do you think this is kind of a step in the right direction? Do you think it will solve the problem? Like, kind of, how do you think that regulation looks in terms of affecting the market?
I mean, it's definitely a good step. It's definitely a good step. What concerns me from time to time when I see regulations coming, it's also related to the timing of the political agenda with the timing of the technology and so on. And the risk is that they are not aligned. So there was a kind of long discussion about introducing a certain kind of obligation also for the trucking industry to move towards electric. That was exactly the wrong timing to do it. And fortunately, it's not in the Green Deal at the moment. Why I'm saying so? Because they were doing it without having any kind of knowledge about the technological framework of the infrastructure available in Europe. So we have something like 3 chargers for trucks in Europe. 3. And we're thinking about making an obligation for the e-trucks, staying on the fact that they did the same for the cars. I'm perfectly fine with the cars, but in trucking industry, you're doing it that can really destroy the logistic chain. I can make also another example about lack of really coordination between policy framework and technology, which is what happened basically in Germany. Germany was really pushing towards logistic actors to invest in e-trucks. They provided a lot of grants for doing it, but super positive from my point of view. The tricky point is that the timing that they asked in order to purchase the vehicles is not in line with the really capacity of the company in producing the vehicles. So it means that in the timing that they have set up, right now we have one brand producing vehicles for a European market. The other ones are not ready. And the vehicles that are coming in the market are definitely more performing than the one that we have. So pragmatically speaking, great idea, great policy, wrong timing. Fortunately, the Green Deal has not this kind of, let's say, bad moves inside. So definitely it's positive, it's going in the right direction. But let's say this kind of discrepancy between timing of policy and a real possibility for the deployment of technology is always there as a risk.
Yeah,
Henry, your final remark.
It is really interesting about policy because I think what the EU is, they seem to be setting percentages of, by so-and-so date, this amount of minerals should come from Europe or this amount recycled. What the US is doing is using tax credits. So unless you produce, you don't get the tax credit, right? So the more you produce, the more tax. But they're not setting targets necessarily about production and things. So it's interesting to see the 2 models and how it's going to work out. Yeah.
Okay, so we're actually run out of time. So I would like to give our speakers a big round of applause. And both Henry Sanderson and Andrea Condotta will will stay with us a few more minutes, so if you have any questions, you can come up to the stage. I would also like to remember that the Italian version of the book, Il prezzo della sostenibilità, for all of you that can either read or understand Italian, is available at the bookshop right at the exit. Otherwise, we'll find the English version of your book that is not available in Italy, but we can find it on Amazon and other online bookstores. So thank you all, and I hope you had a great evening, and we'll see you back tomorrow for the second day of our Festival of Science. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. You're involved in a lot of EU work.